Hello BookTube, this is Aaron from Aaron Read a Book or Aaron Read a Book. This is just the second part of my favourite books of each decade, and this section is the 1920s back to the 1810s. This was harder in a way because there's some weird gaps in my knowledge, but these might be that there's not much. Maybe there's less surviving books from that period, but it's probably me. So if you have books that fit these decades, please recommend me some books. But yeah, this is just a little intro, and now I will cut to the original video. Right, on to the 1920s. This is the first little period where I had a sort of 30-year period where I didn't have a load of 5-star books to choose from. So my runner-ups, I'm going to go down to three mentions. So the three I'm going to mention are All Quiet on the Western Front by Eric Maria Remarque, a devastating World War I book about life in the trenches, told from the German perspective as well, which is interesting, but just maybe my favourite war book. Brilliant. And I'm also going to mention The Murder of Roger Ackroyd by Agatha Christie, which is maybe alongside Crooked House my favourite Agatha Christie. So yeah, it would be a shame to leave Agatha out altogether, but I've thrown in some mentions for her. But the book I'm picking for my favourite book of the 1920s is P.G. Wodehouse's The Inimitable Jeeves, which is the second Jeeves and Wooster book, and it's short stories, and I think his short stories are his best work. I love them. The novels are great too, but I think Jeeves and Wooster work best in short stories. If you've never read Jeeves and Wooster or seen the TV show, it's about a very silly kind of upper class gentleman and his valet, his sort of butler, and Bertie is an idiot, and all his friends are idiots, and they get in all sorts of trouble with aunts and other people like that, family members, women, and Jeeves is his valet, his gentleman's valet, is very smart, gets them out of all sorts of scrapes, and it's just a brilliantly funny book. And they're not just funny though, Woodhouse plays with the English language in a way that no other comedy writer does. He's a brilliant wordsmith as well. On to the 1910s. Here again, fewer shout outs. I didn't have a great deal of choice in this area, so if you've got loads of 1910s and 1920s books to recommend, please do so. I'm going to shout out The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. I also do really like The Trial, but The Metamorphosis is just a very short, perfectly encapsulated piece of Kafka, isn't it? Very odd. No one else is like him. But I also want to shout out The Moon and Sixpence by W. Somerset Maugham as well. I actually prefer The Moon and Sixpence to The Razor's Edge. I think The Moon and Sixpence is his best book. I love it. And that's a sort of retelling or a fictional version of the life of Paul Gauguin, about a man, kind of like how The Razor's Edge is about a man taking a year out to read. This is about like an investment banker or something becoming an artist, and just giving up his life completely to become an artist. And he's a very unpleasant character, but it's such a beautifully written book that it it doesn't matter. That's part of it. That he is this kind of unpleasant man who doesn't care about other people's feelings, and he's doing this all for himself. But his art is also not appreciated in any way during his lifetime, really. And I also want to shout out A Princess of Mars by Edgar Rice Burroughs, the first in the Barsoom novels, which it's not high literature, but it's just great fun. A great series, and I love what I love about science fiction written in the sort of 1910s and before is that it's all imagination, and that they're imagining what Mars could be like, and we have no real information. But the book I'm choosing for my favourite book of the 1910s is an American book, My Antonia by Willa Cather, which is the story of a Bohemian immigrant on the frontiers of America, and it's just incredibly beautifully written book. And I've gone on and read O Pioneers as well, which I really loved as well, which is kind of a loose trilogy with another book which I can't remember the name of, but I basically want to read everything that Willa Cather wrote, because she just writes beautifully. And I think My Antonia I prefer because it has Antonia as such an interesting character, just a vibrant character. Right, where are we at? We're 1900s, so I think that's what you'd call it, 1900s. Again, this is, I'm a bit lower on 5-star reads to choose from here, but I still have some great books in this decade. I'm going to shout out The Call of the Wild by Jack London, which is a great book from the perspective of a dog. The House of Mirth by Edith Wharton, my favourite Edith Wharton book. I haven't read much else of her. I've only read Eve and Frome and The House of Mirth, but I love The House of Mirth. The names is a bit of a misnomer. Let's say Edith Wharton's books are not happy fun times. And I also want to shout out the Railway Children by E. Nesbit, which I read quite recently, and it's known more as a film, I think, in the UK. But I absolutely loved the book. It's a very sweet children's book, or young adult maybe. And speaking of which, the book that I'm choosing as the best book of the 1900 series is L.M. Montgomery's Anne of Green Gables, which is a book about a young orphan on Prince Edward Island in Canada, and this old couple want a young boy to help on their farm, and there's a mix-up somewhere, and they end up with Anne, and Anne is again just a vibrant character who, by the time the old man has driven her to his house to meet his wife, he's already fallen in love with her, and they know that they can't return her and get a boy instead. And it's just the early years of her life in this kind of beautiful setting as well. And it's just such a joyful young adult book that I gave my copy to my niece, so I don't have a copy to show you. But I think every young person should read it. On to the 1890s. There's again fewer. There's sort of a weird period in the middle where I run out of loads of books, and then there's a few decades that it ramps back up again. For the 1890s, I want to shout out my runners up. The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. Like Edgar Rice Burroughs, he just had a wonderful imagination, and because he had no real scientific evidence of what aliens and things were like, he kind of did it all himself, and it's Weird and Wonderful. I could have chosen those of different H.G. Wells ones. I think they're all pretty equal. All the major ones that I've read, I like them all, and he's a really interesting writer who explored different types of science as well. I also want to shout out the Jungle Books by Rudyard Kipling, which is I was quite late to. I only recently read a couple of years ago, a year or two ago. Not at all like I thought it would be from the cartoon, which is, I think, the best Disney cartoon. But elements of the cartoon are taken from the book, but the book is so beautifully written. You could tell he was a great poet. And I also going to shout out Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy, which is a book I read about 20 years ago, and I don't remember a great deal about, apart from it being very miserable, and I really loved it. And it being about a stonemason. But the book I'm choosing for the best book of the 1890s is The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes by Arthur Conan Doyle. So I could have chose A Study in Scarlet for the next decade, but I think The Study in Scarlet is not quite up to the standards of later Holmes, and I think this is where he really takes off being brilliant. Obviously don't need to explain to you who Sherlock Holmes is. It's well worth its reputation. Right, onto the 1880s. This decade again, I didn't have that much on, but there are some interesting books I will shout out as runners up. Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. I read that quite recently, and I really enjoyed it, and it's a lot, again, stranger to what I had in my head as the idea of Jekyll and Hyde. And Treasure Island is also the same decade, so Robert Louis Stevenson obviously was in good form. Three Men in a Boat by Jerome K. Jerome, really funny Victorian novel about three men and a dog in a boat going up the Thames, which if you've seen my video on my author's favourite authors, that book seemed to influence everyone that I really like, from sort of Woodhouse to Terry Pratchett. And I will also shout out The Death of Ivan Ilyich by Leo Tolstoy, which is a very short Tolstoy book, but it's very good. So if you want somewhere to start with Tolstoy and you don't want to start on the big ones, that's a good starting place. But the book I'm choosing for this decade is not a short book. It is The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoevsky. This is a massive book, and I actually don't remember it that well, because I read it when I was in my early 20s, and I just moved to New Zealand, and it had a big impact on me at the time, because I remember I named my mother's sheep. She had sheep. Everyone in New Zealand has sheep. After the three brothers, Alyosha. I can't remember the others. Everyone in the Brothers Karamazov has 8 different names. So I think one's Danya, and maybe Dimitri. But they all have the nicknames and the father's names and everything. But it's a very confusing book. But I remember really liking it, and I think Crime and Punishment I prefer though. But I'm going to say that's my favourite book of the 1880s. But I don't have a lot of other books to choose from, really. None of these books in the 1880s are great favourites of mine. Maybe if I reread Brothers Karamazov, it would become a great favourite of mine. The 1870s, totally different story. This really was a struggle to choose a favourite, although it wasn't a huge pool, but the books that I like in the 1870s are really good. So I'm going to give a quick shout out to Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu, which is a vampire book written 25 years before Dracula, and in my opinion I prefer it over Dracula. I don't think Le Fanu's a better writer than Bram Stoker, but I think Bram Stoker's worse at plotting a book and constructing a book, because Carmilla's short and sweet whereas I found Dracula to have really boring parts in it. The Way We Live Now by Anthony Trollope was 1870s, which is kind of regarded as Trollope's masterpiece. Not my favourite Trollope book, but because it's so different to his other books, it's kind of Trollope's angry book. It's a sort of angry at what's happening in society book, but it is brilliant. It's a brilliant, massive, chunky book. And the other one that I want to mention as a runner-up, which breaks my heart to put it in the runner-up spot, is Middlemarch by George Eliot, which some people regard as the greatest ever English novel. And I do think it's up there. Unfortunately, there was one book in this decade that I like more than Middlemarch, and I mean, if you watch my channel, like, you know, I'm a big fan of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, which I think is my favourite Tolstoy book that I've read, and one of my favourite classics ever. I do think Tolstoy is one of the easiest classics to read. I think people are scared of the Russians, but you shouldn't be, because he's really easy to read, and his books are always about family and things that are universal. I do particularly recommend the Rosemary Edmonds translation if you're looking for one as well, because she's very poetic in her translation, more so than some of the modern translators who are perhaps more accurate. But I guess, like everyone says, find the translation that you like, but I love Rosemary Edmonds' one. I reread Anna Karenina all the time. It's just a brilliant book. On to the 1860s, and again, this is where it takes back off again, where I had loads of choice. There's loads of great 1860s novels. I'm going to shout out another Anthony Trollope book, The Small House at Allington, which is the penultimate book in the Barchester Chronicles, and a quite brave book and interesting choices made in it, and one of my favourites of the whole Barchester series. The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins, great detective fiction before Sherlock Holmes, great about a missing gemstone. War and Peace, that's pretty good. War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, that was in this decade, the 1860s. I don't quite like it as much as Anna Karenina, but it is a great book, and I really want to reread it soon, and I'm going to try a different non-Rosemary Edmonds translation to see if I can get through a different translation. And I also want to mention Fathers and Sons by Ivan Turgenev, another Russian author, much shorter than War and Peace, and a very good book. And Silas Marner by George Eliot. So I've mentioned the two George Eliot books I've read, but I did have to put Middlemarch second in the 1870s. In the 1860s, I'm going to go for my favourite book, being Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. Her final novel, and unfinished. The ending is left off this book, but you kind of know what's going to happen. When I read it last year, I thought the ending being missing wouldn't bother me, and it did more than I thought it would, but not as much as some of the Jane Austen ones that aren't finished. But I do wish she finished this book, because I did love it. It's a big, chunky, again, family drama with quite a narrow focus, so you really get to know the characters. And I just think Elizabeth Gaskell wrote some great varied novels in this period, and this I think was the best of her 1860s stuff. 1850s, I will shout out her other two novels that I really love, North and South and Cranford, were both in the 1850s, and also The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins, which again, another mystery book, one of the earliest mystery books, but I don't quite like it as much as The Moonstone. And the other book I want to shout out is Dr. Thorne by Anthony Trollope, which is the third book in... Is it the third? Yeah, it's the third book in the Barchester Chronicles. So it's no surprise. Well, my favourite book of the 1850s is Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope, the second book in the Barchester Chronicles, and I think the funniest book out of the series. It's not as church politicky as The Warden, but it still has the church politics, but more, I think this one has like the local kind of village town politics and some really funny characters in this one. And you still get some of your favourite characters from The Warden, and some of the characters in this go on to be favourite characters in the later books and stuff. It's just an amazingly good series. My favourite Victorian writer altogether, so that's a big shout out for Anthony Trollope. Coming close to the end now, 1840s, I'm going to shout out Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte, Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray, which I just finished, and was a big influence on Tolstoy and Trollope, but I think you might have guessed from the missing Bronte that my favourite of the 1840s is Wuthering Heights. I do struggle in my head to separate Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights, and even The Tenant of Wildfell Hall I really like as well. I think I mostly pick Wuthering Heights because it's the one that I read quite a few times when I was a teenager, and I think it's probably largely because I loved Kate Bush so much, and the song Wuthering Heights, but I do love all of the Brontes, so I had to pick one, and I've picked probably the most controversial one because a lot of people don't like it because the characters are foul, but and everyone says it's you shouldn't think of it as a romance, but I think it is a romance. It's just a romance of horrible people being horrible to each other, but they still have this sort of obsessive love in it, but yeah, I love the imagery and the weirdness of the Brontes, the windy moors, yeah, great book. Then all of a sudden, 1830s, nothing. I've got nothing in the 1830s. I've got nothing in the 1820s. I don't know what happened in these decades, but I have not read any of the books in them. And we're going to finish on the 1810s, which had a weird amount of good ones, but you probably realise why in a minute. My runners up are Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, which I think is a very Marmite book, but an incredible book for an 18-year-old girl to write, to basically invent some sort of science fiction story in the 1810s. Yeah, I love Frankenstein, and I think, again, very different to what I was expecting. The other books I want to shout out are Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen, Persuasion by Jane Austen, Mansfield Park by Jane Austen, Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. So if you can't guess what my favourite book of the 1810s are, I don't know. I you should be able to guess. It's obviously Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. And I'm going to finish on Pride and Prejudice because my Goodreads after that is like Shakespeare 50, so there's like hundreds of years, or like Greek authors, like Herodotus and stuff. So it really shows that she kind of kicked off the whole thing of my favourite books. I guess this was around when novels were quite new as well. So, but yeah, it's amazing how much Jane Austen then went on to influence everything that I love in all the following decades. But I think apart from that, these sort of last 30 years are quite barren for me. She's like a shining light in the middle of these decades, and then all of a sudden everyone's writing great novels all of a sudden. But that might just be my own ignorance, or that time hasn't kept all those books. And it's strange that time has kept Jane Austen, because there was times when she wasn't as popular as she is now. And even during her life, not as popular. But yeah, this was an interesting little project to do. It took a lot longer than I realised it was going to, so this is going to be a nightmare to edit. But yeah, it was fun. Maybe I need to start seeking out 1800s books, 1700s books, and 1600 books, and then I can go all the way back to Shakespeare, and that would be mad. But yeah. Let me know if you're a fan of any of these books, if you think my runners-up are better than the winners, which I'm sure a lot of people do, because this is my preference. It's not me thinking what is actually the best book of the decade, apart from Pride and Prejudice, which is correct. Have a good one, BookTube. Bye.